Edward, you are being placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending a full investigation. Blake's voice echoed through the overhead boardroom speakers, sharp and amplified, cutting through the low murmur of the room. He stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, and the smooth wood felt freezing cold against my resting palms. A microphone hissed with a brief burst of static before the heavy silence settled back in. The air in the closed room smelled like stale, burnt coffee, mixed with Blake's expensive cedar cologne. On what grounds? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Information theft, my daughter's husband replied. He leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the glass surface. Highly confidential client records have been illegally accessed from the legacy servers. The digital trail leads directly to the basement archives, to your terminal. Victor, our independent board chairman, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. Blake, let us take a breath. Are we sure a public suspension is necessary right this minute? Ed is 70 years old. He built this company from the ground up. That was over 30 years ago, Victor. Blake shot back, not even looking away from me. Edward Harper founded this firm. Yes, we all respect that history. But today, he is simply our corporate archivist. And right now, the archivist is the primary suspect in a massive corporate data breach. I looked across the wide table at Monica. My daughter sat 2 chairs away from her husband, but she might as well have been in another state. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned completely white. She was 42 now, a senior executive in the very building she used to run through as a toddler, and she absolutely refused to meet my gaze. She stared fixedly at a silver pen resting next to her coffee cup. Monica, I said quietly. She flinched. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her voice trembled when she spoke. Dad, just cooperate. If you made a mistake with the old files, we can fix it. But you have to step away and let Blake handle the investigation. The pain that flared in my chest had nothing to do with my age. She actually believed him. Or worse, she was too terrified of her own husband to question his narrative. Everyone in the room knew I had founded the company, but they also believed I had surrendered every ounce of my voting rights and governance authority decades ago. They saw me exactly the way Blake wanted them to see me. I was just a tired old man who had been allowed to keep a desk in the basement out of family pity. We have the access logs, Blake continued, tossing a thick manila folder onto the center of the table. The paper slapped loudly against the wood. Someone logged into the secure client server at 3 in the morning last Tuesday. They bypassed the modern firewall using legacy security clearance that only a handful of people still possess. And you jumped straight to the basement? I said. You spend all day down there surrounded by paper records, Ed. Who else would even know how to use the old network protocols? I am placing you on administrative leave to protect the integrity of this firm. Please leave your security badge on the table. I looked around the room. Samuel Ortiz, our chief operating officer, stared intensely at his leather notebook. Samuel and I had worked together for over 2 decades, building the operational framework of this entire business. But today his mouth remained firmly shut. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight in his chair, but he did not speak up. Blake had moved too fast, calling this executive meeting abruptly and framing it as an administrative matter rather than a formal termination, effectively bypassing the need for a board vote. I reached up to my lapel, unclipped the plastic security badge, and set it down. It made a hollow click against the polished wood. I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my knees, and made sure to keep my back perfectly straight. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend myself to a room full of people who had already made up their minds. I simply turned around and walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing my daughter inside with the man who was actively tearing our family apart. I went down to the basement, packed my reading glasses and a framed photograph of my late wife into a small cardboard box, and took the service elevator up to the lobby. Eleanor Price stood waiting by the glass exit doors. Eleanor had been the lead attorney for the company since we operated out of a rented garage. She wore her usual tailored gray suit, holding a leather legal binder tightly against her chest, and her face was rigid with anger. Ed, she said, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the revolving doors. This is entirely wrong. Blake called that executive meeting an hour before I even arrived in the building. He completely bypassed the legal department. He thinks I am just a standard employee now, Eleanor. He thinks the founder title is just a decorative plaque. I know exactly what he thinks, she replied, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. But he is moving recklessly. He just authorized a company-wide email announcing your suspension. He is trying to convict you in the eyes of the staff before we can even pull the independent server logs. We stopped near the reception desk. A motorcycle courier stepped through the front doors, carrying a thick, beige envelope sealed with red wax. He looked around the lobby, checking a name printed on his digital clipboard. "Eleanor Price?" the young man asked. Eleanor reached out and took the heavy envelope, signing the screen with a quick flick of her finger. I watched her slide her thumb under the wax seal and tear the flap open. She pulled out a single sheet of thick, watermarked paper. I stood quietly, holding my cardboard box, watching the attorney's eyes scan the typed paragraphs. As she read, the tense line of her shoulders slowly dropped, replaced by a stillness that I recognized from our earliest days, fighting off hostile corporate takeovers. "What is it?" I asked. Eleanor looked up from the page, and a very slow, very sharp smile touched the corners of her mouth. "It is a formal notification regarding the corporate bylaws, Ed, and it means Blake Lawson just made the biggest procedural mistake of his entire life." The cardboard box sat on my kitchen counter for 2 hours before I finally unpacked it. My house was completely silent, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I took out my reading glasses, set them next to the sink, and placed the framed photograph of my late wife on the dining table. The glass was cold against my fingers. Before I could reach for the kettle to boil water, my cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed the main corporate office number. Beatrice, our human resources director, spoke in a tight, nervous clip. She had been with the company for a decade, and her voice wavered as she recited the official script. "Mr. Harper, I am calling to formally confirm your administrative leave," Beatrice said. "Under Section 4 of the Employee Conduct Policy, corporate access is restricted pending the security review. Blake has instructed us to forward any press inquiries to the legal department." "Press inquiries?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even. "An internal memo was leaked to the industry trades 20 minutes ago," the director replied, and I could hear the rustle of paper through the receiver. "The headline implies a major data breach linked to a founding executive. I am so sorry, Ed. The policy leaves us no room to maneuver." I thanked her and ended the call. Blake was moving fast, locking down the narrative before anyone could question the sudden executive meeting. He knew a public scandal would force the board of directors to support his suspension, simply to calm the shareholders. My phone vibrated a second time. Monica's name flashed across the screen. I stared at the glowing letters for a long moment before answering. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" I asked. "Dad, why are you making this harder than it has to be?" my daughter said, her breath catching slightly. The investors were panicking. Blake had to make a hard decision to protect the company. If you just accept a quiet retirement, he can frame this as a technical error and let the whole thing fade away. I walked over to the window, watching the autumn wind scatter brown leaves across the driveway. "Did the investors actually panic, Monica? Or did your husband tell you they were panicking?" Silence stretched over the line, a heavy, suffocating quiet. "He is trying to save our family legacy," Monica finally whispered, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "Please do not fight him on this. Just let it go." She hung up before I could respond. The dial tone hummed against my ear, sharp and hollow. She truly believed his story, or she was simply too exhausted by her own marriage to challenge his authority. A sharp knock at the front door pulled me away from the window. I opened it to find Samuel Ortiz standing on the porch. Our chief operating officer wore a thick wool coat, his shoulders hunched against the crisp afternoon chill. He glanced quickly up and down the quiet suburban street before stepping inside the foyer. "I cannot stay long," Samuel said, refusing to take off his coat. "Company policy prohibits me from discussing an active investigation with a suspended employee, but I had to come." "You were very quiet in that boardroom, Sam." My old friend ran a hand over his face, looking older than his 58 years, "because Blake ambushed us. He bypassed the disciplinary committee entirely by calling it an administrative hold. But the timeline is wrong, Ed. The whole thing is wrong." I guided him into the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. "Explain the timeline." "Blake claims the legacy servers were breached at 3 in the morning last Tuesday," the executive explained, keeping his voice low, as if the walls were listening. "He said the digital footprints lead right to your basement terminal. But I checked the physical security logs before I left the building today. Your keycard was not swiped anywhere near the campus that night. Your car never entered the garage. Did you show that to the board?" "Blake sealed the physical logs," Samuel replied, shaking his head. "He told Victor that you must have logged in remotely, using an old admin portal. He has an answer for everything, Ed. He is building a wall around you, brick by brick." Samuel left 10 minutes later, leaving his coffee completely untouched. I stood alone in the kitchen, processing the timeline. If the breach happened at 3 in the morning through a remote portal, it meant someone knew exactly how to navigate the archaic directory structures I had built 30 years ago. My home office was located at the end of the hall. I sat down at my desk, booted up my personal computer, and opened a secured, encrypted program hidden deep in the system files. When I officially retired from the chief executive role, I surrendered my voting shares, but I never disabled my original backdoor access to the legacy servers. It was an old architect's habit, a way to check on the foundation of the house I had built. The screen blinked to life, displaying rows of green text on a black background. I pulled up the Global Authentication Registry for last Tuesday. My eyes scanned the lines of code, searching for the 3 o'clock entry. There it was, an external login ping. The system required a primary clearance code, which anyone in the executive suite could have copied from a manual, but it also required a secondary verification phrase, a highly personalized security question. I highlighted the verification string used to authorize the download. The password was a combination of letters and a specific year. It read, very clearly, Lily, 2008. My chest tightened, a cold weight dropping directly into my stomach. Lily was my granddaughter. 2008 was the year she was born. I was the one who set up the security protocols for the executive team a decade ago, and I remembered sitting in the IT department, helping my daughter choose a password she would never forget. Only one person on the entire corporate network used that exact verification phrase for legacy systems. I leaned back in my chair, the green light of the monitor casting long shadows across the walls of my study. It was not a hacker. It was not Blake overriding the system with his chief executive credentials. The person who logged into the secure archives in the middle of the night, downloading the restricted files that Blake was now using to destroy my reputation, was Monica. I stared at her name in the digital log, the letters burning into my vision. Why would my daughter do that? The green cursor blinked against the black background of my monitor. Lily, 2008. The letters blurred together. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but my fingers refused to move. 34 years ago, I sat in a freezing hospital waiting room, holding Monica wrapped in a pink cotton blanket. I promised to protect her from the world. Now, her name sat in a digital audit log next to a federal data breach. Printing this page and handing it to the board of directors would end my suspension immediately. My reputation would be entirely restored, and my only daughter would face corporate espionage charges, public disgrace, and potential prison time. I reached down and pressed the power button on the computer tower. The screen faded to black, leaving the room in heavy, suffocating silence. I needed to understand the mechanics of the trap. The legacy system was a dinosaur, but it was my dinosaur. I drove across town to a small diner out on the county line, far from the corporate campus. The bell above the glass door chimed loudly. The place smelled heavily of fried onions and bleach. Arthur Vance sat in a corner booth, nursing a mug of black tea. The man ran the records compliance division for 20 years before taking early retirement, and his hands still possessed a nervous tremor from decades of managing corporate liability. He did not look happy to see me. "You are radioactive right now, Ed," Arthur said, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Blake sent a company-wide directive. Anyone communicating with you violates the confidentiality agreement." "I am not asking for company secrets," I replied, sliding into the vinyl booth across from him. "I need you to explain the retention procedure for the legacy archive. If someone logs in with a password, what does the system actually record?" Arthur looked around the empty diner. He picked up a sugar packet, turning it over and over. "The old architecture is paranoid by design. You built it that way. When a user inputs a password, the system does not just open the vault. It generates a security access certificate." I leaned forward. "Where does that certificate go?" "It gets routed to the deep storage server," the retired director explained, his eyes darting toward the window. "But that is not the part you need to worry about. The password only identifies the user. It does not grant permission to download restricted client files." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Meaning what?" "Meaning a standard user password cannot pull those files alone," Arthur said flatly. "The system requires a secondary key, an executive override." By the time I returned home, the autumn wind had picked up, rattling the loose shingles on my roof. A silver luxury sedan sat parked in my driveway. Monica stood on the front porch, her expensive wool coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. The dark circles under her eyes were poorly hidden by makeup, and manicured fingers gripped her leather purse tight enough to turn her knuckles white. I unlocked the front door and guided my daughter into the living room. Blake says the board is preparing to vote on a formal termination tomorrow morning, Monica said, refusing to sit down. She paced the length of the oriental rug. He told me to come here. He says, if you sign the severance agreement tonight, he will convince them to drop the internal investigation. I watched her pace. Every cadence, every word choice belonged to her husband. The man was using her terror to secure my surrender. Did he tell you why the board is moving so fast? I asked gently. Monica stopped, staring at the floorboards. Because the evidence is overwhelming, Dad. He said the breach was traced directly to your terminal. He is trying to save you from a public lawsuit. The truth clicked into place, cold and sharp. Blake asked his wife to access the archive, probably framing it as a routine check or a favor to him. The young executive logged in, completely unaware that a trap was waiting in the digital shadows. Her husband built a narrative, manipulated his wife into providing the access log, and then used that very log to hold me hostage. Fighting back meant destroying her. Surrendering meant he won everything. Tell your husband I need until tomorrow morning to review the paperwork, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Her shoulders dropped, the tight lines around her mouth finally relaxing. She hugged me quickly, her coat smelling of jasmine and nervous sweat, before hurrying back to her car. I stood in the doorway, watching the red taillights disappear down the quiet street. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Eleanor Price spoke the moment I answered the call. I just left the county courthouse, the attorney said, her voice sharp and rapid. I filed a preservation order on the legacy servers. Blake tried to block it, claiming national security concerns regarding the client data, but the judge signed the injunction. Did you find the security access certificate, Eleanor? Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. Our independent auditor pulled the metadata 20 minutes ago. The certificate exists, Ed. Someone accessed the vault at 3 in the morning. I know who accessed it, I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. No, you only know half of the equation, Eleanor shot back. The audit trail shows the login credential, but the legacy system required an active executive override to actually open the restricted folders. The password simply knocked on the door. Someone else had to turn the key. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, echoing through the empty house. I gripped the phone, staring out at the darkening street. Who approved the access? I asked. That is exactly what we are going to find out, the lawyer said, her tone hardening into pure steel. Because the certificate clearly states the download required direct authorization from the chief executive officer. The silence in my living room felt heavier after Eleanor hung up the phone. Direct authorization from the chief executive officer. Those words repeated in my mind, locking into place like the final tumblers of a bank vault. Blake did not just manipulate his wife into accessing the restricted files. The man officially approved her entry using his own executive credentials, creating a perfect loop of deniability. I picked up my phone and dialed our chief operating officer. Samuel answered on the second ring, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of a television playing in the background. I told him exactly what the attorney had discovered and what we needed to do next. My former colleague hesitated for a long moment, breathing heavily into the receiver, before finally agreeing to meet me at the loading dock of the corporate campus. The autumn air bit at my face when I stepped out of my truck an hour later. Samuel stood shivering near the steel delivery doors, holding a master key card in his right hand. He swiped the plastic square, and the heavy metal door clicked open with a solid thud. We stepped into the concrete corridor of the lower basement. The space smelled of ozone and damp cardboard, a sharp contrast to the polished mahogany suites 50 floors above us. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the industrial ventilation system. If security catches us down here, Blake will have cause to fire me by morning, Samuel muttered, scanning the empty hallway. The board of directors is already nervous, Ed. Victor called an emergency session for tomorrow afternoon to finalize your termination. Blake is pushing them hard. I nodded, walking past the rows of modern server racks toward a locked door at the very back of the facility. Blake thinks entirely in digital terms, Sam. He believes deleting a file from a cloud server erases it from existence. But he joined this firm a decade ago, and he never bothered to learn how we built the original architecture. I unlocked the metal door with a brass key I had carried on my ring for 30 years. We entered a room filled with towering metal filing cabinets and outdated terminals covered in heavy dust covers. In the far corner sat a massive gray dot matrix printer. Back in the early days of the company, before cloud storage became the corporate standard, I wrote a hard-coded compliance rule into the mainframe. Every single time an executive override was used to access the restricted vault, the The system sent a digital log to the main servers, but it also triggered a physical printout, a permanent, undeniable paper audit copy. Samuel watched in total silence as I pulled open the heavy steel drawer beneath the printer. Hundreds of continuous feed paper sheets lay folded neatly inside, tracking every major security event for the past 5 years. I ran my fingers along the perforated edges, flipping back through the stack to last Tuesday. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled out a single sheet of green bar paper and held it up to the dim fluorescent light. Printed in thick block letters was a CEO authorization form. The document clearly detailed a request for legacy archive access, initiated by Monica Harper and officially approved by Blake Lawson. It even included the specific internal protocol address routed directly from his executive computer. "He really did it," Samuel whispered, staring over my shoulder at the paper. "He authorized the breach, let his own wife leave the digital footprints, and then blamed the entire thing on you." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my wool coat. We finally had the proof we needed to show the board that Blake bypassed mandatory governance procedures. But a piece of paper could not explain the psychological manipulation happening inside my daughter's home. I needed to know exactly what lie my son-in-law told her. Early the next morning, I waited at a small corner bakery 2 blocks from Monica's favorite yoga studio. She walked through the glass doors right at 7 o'clock, ordering a black coffee and checking her phone obsessively. I stood up from my corner table and called her name. My daughter froze, her shoulders stiffening under her athletic jacket. She walked over slowly and slid into the booth across from me. She looked completely exhausted, her eyes darting toward the front window, as if expecting her husband to walk past at any second. "You are not supposed to be talking to me, Dad," Monica said, wrapping both hands tightly around her paper cup. "Blake said the legal department is monitoring everything you do." "Blake is lying to you, sweetheart," I replied softly, keeping my hands resting flat on the table. "I know you logged into the archive last Tuesday at 3 in the morning. I know you used the password we created together when Lily was born." The color completely drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. A tear spilled over her lower lash line, tracking quickly down her pale cheek. "I am not angry with you," I continued, leaning forward to close the distance between us. "But I need you to tell me exactly why you opened those files. What did your husband say to you that night?" Monica swallowed hard, staring down at her black coffee. "He woke me up in a panic. He said the board was secretly investigating you for hoarding old client data to use as leverage for a larger pension payout. Blake told me he needed to check the legacy servers to prove your innocence, but his new security badge lacked the proper clearance. He begged me to log in so he could clear your name before the board found out." A cold wave of disgust washed over me, settling deep in my bones. Blake weaponized her love for me, tricking her into committing a corporate crime under the guise of protecting her father. He then used that exact crime to publicly suspend me and secure his total control over the firm. He played us both perfectly. My cell phone vibrated against the wooden table. Eleanor was calling again. I answered the phone, keeping my eyes fixed on my grieving daughter. "Ed, we have a massive problem," the attorney said, her voice tight with absolute panic. "The independent auditor just finished running the preservation order on the digital servers. The electronic copy of the authorization form is gone." "What do you mean it is gone?" I asked. "Blake initiated a routine digital purge at midnight," Eleanor explained, the sound of frantic typing echoing in the background. "He completely wiped the executive authorization logs, claiming it was standard procedure to clear server space. The digital proof of his involvement no longer exists. If we go into that board review tomorrow without evidence, it becomes his word against yours, and he holds the executive chair." I reached into my coat pocket, feeling the crisp edge of the folded printer paper resting safely against my chest. I slid my hand out of my wool coat pocket, leaving the folded printer paper safely inside. Monica stared at me across the small bakery table. Her black coffee had stopped steaming minutes ago. The espresso machine hissed loudly behind the counter, but the sound barely registered over the heavy silence between us. "Your husband did not ask for your help to protect me," I told her, keeping my voice low and steady. "He asked for your assistance because the chief executive needed someone to open that door, and the man knew you would never question his motives." "No," Monica whispered. She shook her head rapidly, though her fingers trembled against the cardboard coffee sleeve. "Blake said the board of directors was coming after you. He swore he was trying to delete the files before Victor saw them." I needed her to understand the timeline without shattering her completely. I remembered the first year she brought Blake to our house for Thanksgiving. 11 years ago. The young, ambitious executive spent the entire dinner agreeing with every word I said, mimicking my opinions and mirroring my posture. I thought he was simply nervous about meeting his boss. I did not realize he was studying me. He spent a decade learning exactly how to exploit the people I loved. The board never launched an investigation, I explained gently, leaning forward so she would have to look at me. Victor did not even know about the legacy files until yesterday morning. Blake created the crisis, sweetheart. He authorized your access from his personal terminal, waited for you to download the records, and then used that exact digital footprint to suspend me. Monica pulled her hands away from the cup. She tore a paper napkin into tiny, jagged strips, her eyes darting toward the front window. You are wrong. Blake would not do that to me. We are a family. Then ask him about the paper audit trail, I replied. Ask him why he initiated a digital purge of the server logs last night at midnight. Her breath hitched. She looked away, staring blankly at the morning traffic outside. The truth was settling over her, heavy and suffocating. My daughter remembered the late nights, the sudden urgency in his voice, and the way her husband framed everything as a desperate mission to save her father. The realization played out across her face, line by precise line. I did not reach out to hold her hand, because she needed to process the betrayal on her own terms. I have to go back to the office, Monica finally said, her voice completely hollow. She stood up and grabbed her leather purse. I need to look at his computer. I need to see the logs for myself. Do not tell him what you know, I warned her. If Blake realizes we have physical proof, he will find a way to twist the narrative again. She nodded once, turning away without another word. I watched her walk down the sidewalk. Her posture was rigid, entirely different from the frightened woman who sat down 30 minutes earlier. An hour later, I sat in the back booth of the county public library with Eleanor and Samuel. The smell of old paper and floor wax filled the quiet room. I reached into my coat and placed the green bar printer paper on the scratched wooden table. Eleanor stared at the faded ink, her eyes widening as she traced the authorization code with the tip of her silver pen. This proves he ordered the access, the attorney murmured, looking up at me. It proves Blake bypassed the governance safeguards. But the board might still argue he was conducting a legitimate security test on the system. We have the weapon, Ed. We do not have the motive. Samuel leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. Our chief operating officer looked exhausted, his tie loosened around his collar. But the hesitation from yesterday was completely gone. I can give you the motive, Samuel said quietly. We both looked at him. 3 days before the breach, the executive continued, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. Blake called me into his office. He was frantic. The external auditors were about to discover a massive discrepancy in the third quarter financial projections. Blake inflated the numbers to secure his own executive bonus, and the missing capital was about to become public knowledge. Samuel paused, glancing around the empty library aisle before finishing his thought. He told me, verbatim, that we needed a distraction. We needed someone the board would believe caused a systemic failure. A scapegoat. The final pieces locked together. Blake did not just take advantage of a random security flaw. My son-in-law intentionally searched for a believable target to cover his own financial fraud. He chose me because my daily access to the basement archives made the story plausible, and he used his own wife to plant the digital evidence. Will you say that in front of the board? Eleanor asked, her tone tight with anticipation. I will testify at the independent board review tomorrow, Samuel confirmed, nodding slowly. But my word against the chief executive is a massive risk. Victor will demand physical proof that Blake intended to frame Ed before the breach even happened. I thought about the sudden digital purge. He erased the primary servers last night. Any message he sent regarding a scapegoat is gone. Eleanor sat back in her wooden chair and stared up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face. She pulled a slim laptop out of her leather bag and opened the screen. He erased the primary servers, Ed, the lawyer said. But this company was built on an archaic foundation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a deeply buried corporate directory. Company policy dictates that all executive communications are routed through a secondary backup system every 48 hours. It is an old compliance rule from the 90s. A system so old, our modern chief executive probably does not even know it operates in the background. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. Where are those backup drives kept? Off-site, Eleanor replied, tapping the screen. In a secure storage facility on the other side of the river. The data center only releases records under a direct court order. If Blake sent an internal email looking for a scapegoat, The complete chain is sitting on a magnetic drive right now. The attorney closed her laptop, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. We just have to secure a preservation notice from the judge and extract those fragments before Blake realizes his mistake. Eleanor did not wait for the morning sun. She drafted the preservation notice right there at the scratched library table, sent it to a county judge she had known for 20 years, and secured the official signature within 2 hours. We drove across the river in complete silence. The off-site data center looked like a concrete bunker sitting in the middle of a deserted industrial park, surrounded by chain-link fences and security cameras. Inside, the temperature dropped significantly, and the deafening hum of cooling fans filled the sterile white corridors. A facility manager reviewed the court order, checked Eleanor's credentials twice, and led us into a secure vault. He pulled a rectangular silver drive from a towering metal rack, handing it over with a customized decryption key. We had the magnetic backup. Now we needed to see exactly what Blake thought he had permanently erased. Back in the warm glow of my home office, Eleanor connected the drive to her laptop. Samuel stood near the window, staring out at the darkening street while the recovery software processed the encrypted files. Lines of code scrolled across the screen for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a reconstructed inbox appeared on the monitor. The lawyer filtered the messages by date, narrowing the search to the exact window Samuel had identified. 3 days before the data breach. Eleanor clicked on an internal message sent directly from the chief executive account to a private legal consultant. I leaned over her shoulder, reading the recovered text illuminated on the bright screen. Blake did not mince words. He explained the upcoming audit would expose a massive financial discrepancy in the third quarter projections, and he outlined a clear, calculated strategy to survive the fallout. We cannot let the auditors dictate the narrative, the message read. We need a major operational distraction. Find a vulnerability in the legacy servers. We need someone the board will believe caused a systemic failure. Someone old enough to make a credible mistake, so we can bury the financial deficit in the restructuring costs. My hands gripped the back of Eleanor's chair. The printed authorization form proved Blake executed the plan, but this recovered email proved he invented the entire crisis just to save his own bonus. He actively shopped for a victim. He looked at the company roster and chose his own father-in-law, simply because my age and my office location fit his fabricated story perfectly. We have the complete chain, Eleanor said, saving the file and generating a secure physical copy on a portable drive. We have the access certificate, the authorization form, and the confession of intent. He is finished, Ed. She was right, but the impending victory tasted like rust. Destroying Blake meant destroying the life my daughter had built for the past 10 years. Right as Eleanor closed her laptop, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. I walked to the front door and opened it before she could even knock. Monica stood on the porch, her hair damp from the evening rain. She looked past me, her eyes completely hollow, and stepped into the hallway. She did not take off her expensive wool coat. I checked his home computer, my daughter whispered, her voice cracking on the final syllable. He left it unlocked while he was taking a phone call in the other room. The executive logs were completely empty. He wiped them just like you said. I guided her into the kitchen and pulled out one of the wooden dining chairs. She sank into it, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach as if in physical pain. I did not want to show her the recovered email. I wanted to protect her from the absolute cruelty of his words, but hiding the truth would only leave her vulnerable to his ongoing lies. I placed a printed copy of the recovered message on the table in front of her. Monica read the email slowly. Her breathing hitched, shallow and erratic, and a single tear dropped onto the paper, blurring the black ink. She realized her husband had planned to sacrifice her father days before he ever woke her up in the middle of the night to ask for a favor. He never truly loved her. He only saw her as a convenient tool to unlock a digital door, and he used her hands to plant the evidence he needed to destroy my reputation. Her cell phone buzzed against the wooden table. The screen lit up with a picture of Blake smiling on a sailboat, taken during their anniversary trip last summer. Monica stared at the device like it was a venomous snake. She reached out with a trembling finger and tapped the speaker button. "Honey, where are you?" Blake asked, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. "You left the house without saying goodbye. I am just worried about you, given everything happening with your dad." Monica squeezed her eyes shut. She bit down on her lower lip to keep from sobbing, and she refused to answer him. "Listen, I know this is incredibly hard," the chief executive continued, filling the silence with his smooth cadence. "But the board is out for blood. Victor wants to press criminal charges against Ed for the data theft. I am doing everything in my power to protect him, but you have to trust me. We have to stand united on this." He was still playing the savior. Even now, with his financial fraud about to be exposed, he relied on manipulating his wife to keep his fragile narrative intact. Monica reached out and ended the call, pushing the phone across the table until it hit the far wall. Eleanor walked into the kitchen, holding a thick stack of manila folders. She had compiled the physical evidence into 3 identical binders, perfectly organized for the independent board review. We had the proof, the timeline, and the clear intent. All we needed was the opportunity to present the facts to the chairman. My computer chimed from the home office down the hall. An urgent corporate notification alert echoed through the quiet house. I left my daughter sitting at the table and walked down the corridor to check the monitor. The message originated from the executive suite, flagged with high priority, and sent to every senior director in the company. Blake was not waiting for the scheduled review. He had just invoked a crisis protocol, calling an emergency board meeting for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and demanding an immediate binding vote on my permanent termination. The mahogany doors of the executive boardroom closed with a heavy final click at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, trapping the humid smell of damp wool coats and bitter coffee inside the room. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long gray shadows across the massive, polished table. Victor sat at the head, shuffling a stack of printed agendas with slow, deliberate movements. The independent chairman cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed reading glasses before looking around the silent room. "This emergency review is now in session," Victor announced, his voice tight and formal. "We are here to vote on the permanent termination of Edward Harper." Blake did not even wait for the chairman to finish his introductory remarks. My son-in-law stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and projected his voice to the far corners of the room. "We are here because the absolute integrity of this firm has been compromised," Blake said, staring directly at me with cold, flat eyes. "Ed Harper breached our secure legacy archives. He exploited outdated protocols to access restricted financial projections, putting our entire upcoming corporate audit at massive risk. I suspended him immediately to stop the bleeding, and today I am asking this board to sever his ties with the company completely." I kept my hands resting flat on the wooden table, refusing to give the chief executive the emotional reaction he desperately wanted. Eleanor sat beside me, her leather binder securely closed. The attorney tapped a silver pen against her yellow legal pad, radiating a perfect, practiced calm. Victor turned his attention down the length of the table. "We have reviewed the digital access logs provided by the executive suite. Before we vote, our corporate protocol allows for witness statements. Monica, your husband submitted your name regarding the night of the breach." My daughter sat near the far window, separated from her husband by 3 empty chairs. She wore a dark gray suit, her posture rigid, and her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. She looked completely exhausted, her skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Yes," Monica said softly. She took a deep breath, and her voice gained a fraction of strength. "I logged into the archive at 3 in the morning last Tuesday, but I did not do it for my father." A low murmur rippled through the seated board members. Blake shifted his weight, a small muscle feathering rapidly along his jawline. "I used a password I created 18 years ago," Monica continued, refusing to look at the man she married. "Blake woke me up in the middle of the night. He told me the board was secretly investigating my father, and he needed me to open the servers so he could clear his name. I only accessed the restricted files because the chief executive explicitly asked me to do it." The young executive was incredibly fast, weaving a new lie out of her confession before the echo of her words even faded from the room. "That is a complete misrepresentation of the facts," Blake countered smoothly, his tone shifting into practiced, patient concern. He looked at the senior board members, offering them a weary, sympathetic smile. "I discovered unauthorized digital pings on the legacy server that night. I woke my wife to verify if her father had ever shared his old access codes with her. When she checked the system, we saw the download already in progress. I had to secure the network immediately to protect our clients." Samuel Ortiz pushed his chair back from the table. The heavy wood scraped loudly against the carpet, cutting through Blake's smooth narrative. Our chief operating officer stood up, holding a single sheet of green bar printer paper. "The chief executive did not secure the network," Samuel stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "He authorized the breach. Company policy requires an executive override to pull those specific files, and I hold the physical paper audit generated by that exact request." Blake bypassed all mandatory governance procedures and used his own executive credentials to open the vault. Samuel slid the paper across the long table. Victor picked it up, studying the faded ink and the digital signature printed at the bottom. Furthermore, the operations director added, looking directly at Blake, "This man called me into his office 3 days before this supposed breach. He told me the third quarter financials were short, and he explicitly stated we needed a scapegoat to blame for the missing capital." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Two directors started speaking at once, demanding answers from the head of the table. Blake slammed his palm flat against the mahogany surface, silencing the room with a sharp crack. "This is an orchestrated smear campaign," the chief executive shouted, his face flushing dark red. He pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "Ed knows he is cornered. He convinced a loyal friend and a stressed daughter to lie for him. You have a printed piece of paper from a machine Ed controls in his own basement. Anyone could have forged that authorization." Eleanor finally moved. She opened her leather binder and extracted the printed email we had recovered from the off-site backup drive the night before. "We also have your deleted internal communications," the attorney said, her voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "Preserved under a direct court order. You documented your search for a vulnerable target, Blake." The chief executive stared at the email copy resting on the table. For a fraction of a second, absolute panic flashed behind his eyes. But the man was a corporate survivor. He straightened his tie, adjusted his silver cuffs, and lifted his chin. "A target for a restructuring initiative," Blake lied, his voice dropping to a smooth, incredibly reasonable cadence. "I was discussing departmental layoffs to balance the budget, Eleanor. Taking an ambiguous email phrase and a forged printout to justify a founder stealing client data is absolutely absurd. I acted under emergency executive powers to protect this firm from a rogue employee." He turned to Victor, crossing his arms firmly over his chest. "I call for the vote, Victor, right now. We terminate Edward Harper, or I resign as chief executive and take the entire executive suite with me." The threat hung heavy in the cold air. The senior board members exchanged nervous, silent glances. Blake had grown the corporate revenue for 3 consecutive years, and the major investors loved his aggressive tactics. Firing a beloved chief executive over a disputed internal investigation would tank the quarterly stock price, and Victor knew it. The chairman sighed, rubbing his temples with his fingertips. "The evidence is entirely contradictory. We have severe allegations of data theft against Ed, and equally severe allegations of procedural abuse against Blake. We need time to verify these documents with outside counsel." "There is nothing left to verify," Blake insisted, leaning his weight over the table. "He is an archivist. I am the chief executive. You have the access logs." Eleanor reached into her leather binder one last time. She touched the edge of a thick, watermarked document, but she did not pull it out of the folder. She looked at me, and I gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was fully set, but springing it required immense patience. We needed Blake to fully commit to his abuse of authority on the official record before delivering the final blow. "The legal department has one final document to submit," Eleanor announced, her voice perfectly level. "A document that clarifies exactly who holds ultimate authority in this specific situation." Victor raised a hand, stopping her before she could slide the paper across the table. The chairman looked at the antique clock ticking on the far wall. "The tensions in this room are far too high to make a rational, binding decision," Victor said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "We will pause this review. The board will independently authenticate the emails and the paper audit tonight. We will reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to review Eleanor's final document and cast the binding vote." Victor struck his wooden gavel against the sound block. The sharp crack echoed through the boardroom, signaling a temporary ceasefire. We had survived the opening battle, but tomorrow morning, that single unread page would determine whether my family legacy survived the war. 9 o'clock arrived with a sharp, blinding glare of autumn sunlight cutting through the boardroom windows. The morning storm had passed during the night, leaving the sky a pale, bruised purple over the city skyline. I sat in the same leather chair I had occupied yesterday, resting my hands flat against the cold mahogany table. The air inside the executive suite felt entirely different today. A heavy, suffocating anticipation replaced the usual hum of corporate confidence. Victor sat at the head of the table, looking 10 years older than he had the previous afternoon. The independent chairman placed his gold reading glasses on top of 3 thick manila folders. "Our outside counsel worked through the night," Victor announced, his voice lacking its usual booming cadence. "The physical printer audit provided by Samuel is authentic. The recovered server emails are genuine." My son-in-law did not flinch. Blake stood tall at the opposite end of the room, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive silk suit. He still believed his title offered him absolute protection. A technical misstep, the chief executive argued smoothly, spreading his hands in a gesture of practiced transparency. I acted aggressively to protect client data, and I may have bent an internal guideline to stop a security threat, but I am the chief executive officer of this firm. I have the absolute authority to suspend a basement archivist who puts our corporate security at risk. We can deal with the operational fallout later. Eleanor Price stood up slowly. The veteran attorney did not raise her voice, and she did not need to. She simply unclasped her leather binder and extracted the single sheet of thick, watermarked paper she had received in the lobby 2 days ago. Edward Harper is not a basement archivist, Eleanor said, sliding the heavy document across the polished wood toward the chairman, and you never possessed the authority to suspend him. Blake let out a short, dismissive laugh. He surrendered his voting shares a decade ago, Eleanor. Ed is a standard employee. Read the document, Victor, the lawyer instructed, ignoring the chief executive completely. Victor picked up the watermarked paper. The room fell so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. The chairman scanned the typed paragraphs, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the archaic legal phrasing. He looked up, staring directly at the young man who had tried to hijack the company. This is a certified copy of the original corporate bylaws, Victor explained, addressing the entire room. Specifically, it highlights Section 4, Paragraph 2, the Founder's Stewardship Clause. A confused murmur rippled down the table. Most of the senior directors had joined the firm long after I stepped down from the primary leadership role, and they had never read the original charter. Please read it aloud for the official record, Eleanor pressed. Victor cleared his throat, holding the paper up to the morning light. Edward Harper retains permanent stewardship authority over the corporate archive and its foundational assets. Any disciplinary action, including administrative suspension or termination, involving a founding steward requires a mandatory, independent legal review prior to execution. The chairman slowly lowered the document, a review conducted by outside counsel, not the chief executive. The realization settled heavily over the executive suite, striking with the force of a physical blow. Blake had not just fired an old man to cover up a financial discrepancy. By skipping the mandatory legal review to stage a public humiliation, he had knowingly bypassed the absolute highest governance safeguard built into the company foundation. His attempt to avoid board scrutiny violated the core corporate charter. The color drained entirely from Blake's face. His mouth opened, but his smooth, rehearsed excuses completely failed him. The young executive looked around the table, realizing the narrative had slipped from his grasp permanently. He turned toward Monica, searching the room for his most reliable ally. But my daughter kept her eyes firmly fixed on her untouched coffee cup. She knew exactly what kind of man he was now, and she refused to offer him a single ounce of comfort. My innocence regarding the data breach was no longer the primary issue. Blake's deliberate abuse of authority became the weapon that destroyed his own position. He committed financial fraud, manipulated his wife into stealing restricted records, and then shattered corporate law to cover his tracks. The man lost because his arrogance blinded him to the structural rules I wrote 30 years ago. Victor set the watermarked page down carefully. He took a long, slow breath, looking at the crumbling executive who had nearly torn our legacy apart. The charges of information theft against Edward Harper are immediately dismissed, the chairman stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The administrative suspension was illegal from the moment it was issued. I finally relaxed my shoulders, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. My name was clear, and my daughter was safe from the fallout of his digital trap. Eleanor, however, remained standing. She looked directly at Blake, her expression carved from pure ice. The illegal suspension is resolved, the attorney said, turning her attention back to the senior directors seated around the table. Now we must address the financial fraud, the missing third-quarter capital, and the deliberate breach of fiduciary duty committed by the man currently standing in this room. A tense, electric energy flooded the boardroom. Samuel Ortiz leaned forward, opening his own notebook to the financial discrepancies we had uncovered, ready to present the final nail in the coffin. Victor picked up his wooden gavel, his grip white-knuckled against the polished handle. The board will now prepare to cast a binding vote regarding the immediate removal of Blake Lawson. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block with a sharp, echoing crack. Victor did not ask for further discussion, and the remaining board members did not offer any. The chairman simply called for a show of hands to immediately terminate the chief executive officer for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. 7 hands went up without a single moment of hesitation. The vote was completely unanimous. Blake stared at the raised hands, his posture crumbling in real time. The man who had walked into this room carrying absolute power now stood completely frozen, his expensive silk suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He opened his mouth, perhaps to threaten legal action or remind the directors of his quarterly revenue streaks. But Eleanor cut him off before he could form a single word. "Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items," the attorney said, carefully packing her manila folders back into her leather binder. "You are formally barred from accessing any corporate networks. In addition, the board has authorized outside counsel to initiate a full civil investigation into the missing third-quarter capital, and we are submitting a formal referral to federal regulators regarding your financial fraud." Blake finally looked away from the lawyer, turning his desperate gaze toward the far end of the long mahogany table. Monica had stood up, holding her gray wool coat tightly over her arm. "Monica," Blake said, his voice dropping into that familiar, soothing rhythm he used to calm nervous investors. "Let us go home. We need to call my attorney and handle this together." My daughter did not walk toward him. She moved around the back of the heavy leather chairs, keeping a solid physical distance between herself and the man she had loved for over a decade. "I am not going home with you," Monica told him, her voice perfectly steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I packed your bags last night after I read the emails you thought you deleted. The house locks have already been changed." Blake took a step forward, his mask slipping entirely. "You are making a terrible mistake," he warned her, his tone losing its friendly facade and revealing the cold, calculating threat beneath. "You will not see a single cent of the executive pension." Monica offered him a small, incredibly sad smile. "I do not care about your money, Blake. I only care about the truth." He reached for her arm, but Samuel stepped smoothly between them, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Blake looked around the silent boardroom, realizing he had absolutely no advantage left to play. He turned on his heel and walked out the heavy doors, 2 uniformed security guards falling into step right behind him. The sudden quiet in the executive suite felt entirely different from the suffocating tension we experienced an hour ago. The poison was finally drawn out, but the corporate body still needed to survive the cure. I walked out of the boardroom a few minutes later, stepping into the massive glass atrium that overlooked the main operational floors. Word traveled remarkably fast in a building filled with thousands of nervous professionals. As I walked past the glass partitions, people stopped typing on their keyboards. A young woman from the accounting department stood up from her desk and started clapping. Within 10 seconds, the entire floor was on its feet. They did not cheer wildly, but the steady, respectful applause echoed through the vast open space, washing away the bitter sting of my public suspension. Victor joined me near the elevator banks, holding a printed draft of a press release in his right hand. "We are sending this to the industry trades in 20 minutes, the chairman explained, handing me the thick paper. "It officially clears your name, attributes the data breach to a thwarted external attack, and announces Blake Lawson has been removed due to an internal restructuring effort. We are keeping the financial fraud quiet until the civil investigation concludes." I read the statement, nodding slowly. It was clean, efficient, and legally sound. The older man rubbed his tired eyes, looking out over the sea of applauding employees. "The market is going to react violently to this news, Ed. Our stock price will drop by noon, and the shareholders are going to panic. We need stability, and we need it immediately." Victor turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. "The board wants you to formally step back into the chief executive chair, today." I looked down at the drafted press release, feeling the crisp edge of the paper between my fingers. I spent 40 years building this firm from a rented garage into a global enterprise. I poured my blood, my sweat, and my absolute soul into every single brick of this building. But standing there, listening to the steady applause of the people who actually kept the lights on, I realized something fundamental about leadership. "No," I said quietly, handing the paper back to the chairman. Victor blinked, clearly caught off guard by the refusal. "Ed, you are the founding steward. You just proved you still understand this infrastructure better than anyone else. The company needs you to guide us through this transition." "I built this firm to survive without me," I told the chairman, my voice calm but entirely unyielding. "If it relies solely on my presence to function, then I failed as a founder. If I take that chair, I am just dragging us back to the past. I fought to clear my name and protect my daughter, Victor. I did not fight to reclaim a crown." I pressed the glowing button on the wall, and the silver elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside, leaving the chairman standing alone in the bright glass atrium. "So," Victor called out, just as the steel doors began to close. "Who is going to lead us?" The silver doors slid shut before Victor could demand an answer, sealing me inside the quiet hum of the descending elevator. I did not need to give the chairman a name, because the board already knew the only logical choice. Samuel Ortiz spent 2 decades maintaining the operational foundation of this firm, while other men chased magazine covers and quarterly bonuses. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a company-wide email officially announced our chief operating officer as the acting executive leader, and the restless corporate campus finally took a collective breath. I waited near the front reception desk for one specific reason. The afternoon sunlight cast long, golden rectangles across the polished marble floor, and the lobby smelled faintly of rain and lemon wax. 30 minutes later, a private elevator chimed softly, and Blake Lawson stepped out into the open space. The man who had worn his corporate authority like an impenetrable suit of armor now looked completely ordinary. He carried a single brown cardboard box containing a few framed photographs and a handful of personal items. 2 silent security guards flanked him, keeping a respectful but firm distance. Blake stopped halfway across the lobby, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He looked incredibly tired, and the arrogant set of his jaw had been replaced by a tight, bitter line. I did not step forward to gloat, and I did not offer him a single word of pity. I simply stood by the reception desk and watched. My former son-in-law tightened his grip on the cardboard box, turned his back to the reception area, and pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors. He walked out into the crisp autumn wind, entirely stripped of his power, and disappeared into the city traffic. I walked out the side exit a few minutes later, heading toward the visitor parking garage. The storm clouds had completely broken apart, leaving a clear, brilliant blue sky over the manicured corporate grounds. Monica stood waiting beside the passenger door of my old truck. She had changed out of her dark executive suit, wearing a simple gray sweater and faded denim jeans. Her expensive leather purse rested on the hood of the truck, and she held a hot cup of tea between her hands. "I watched him leave from my office window," my daughter said quietly as I approached. She did not look at me right away, keeping her gaze fixed on the towering glass building behind us. "He got into a taxi, and he did not even look back at the building." "Men like Blake never look back," I replied, leaning against the cold metal of the truck door. "They only look for the next available target." Monica swallowed hard, and her shoulders finally dropped. The rigid perfection she had maintained for a decade seemed to melt away, leaving behind a profound, devastating exhaustion. She turned to face me, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I am so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling over the words. "I should have known he was lying. I should have come to you the moment he asked me to open that digital archive, but I let him use my history against you instead." I reached out and gently took the paper cup from her shaking hands, setting it next to her purse on the hood. I pulled my daughter into a tight embrace, resting my chin against the top of her head just like I did when she was a little girl, frightened by a heavy thunderstorm. She buried her face in my wool coat and wept quietly, letting out years of manipulated fear and silent anxiety. "You made a terrible mistake," I told her, keeping my voice steady and completely honest. "You chose to protect your marriage by ignoring your own intuition, and it nearly cost this family everything. I forgive you, Monica, but you have to live with the reality of what happened, so you never let another person control your mind like that again." She nodded against my chest, her tears soaking into the heavy wool fabric. We stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle through the large oak trees lining the parking lot. The healing process would take months, perhaps years, and the legal battles surrounding the financial fraud were only just beginning. But the absolute worst part was finally over. The truth was out in the open, and the suffocating shadows were gone. We eventually pulled away from the embrace. I handed her the warm cup of tea, and we began to walk slowly along the paved path that circled the corporate campus. The afternoon air felt incredibly clean. "Samuel wants me to stay on as a senior consultant," Monica said, taking a slow sip of her drink. "He told me the new executive team needs people who actually understand the original mission of the company." I told him I needed a few weeks of personal leave to hire a divorce attorney and pack up the house. "Take all the time you need," I advised her, matching her slow pace along the concrete walkway. "The company will still be here when you are ready to return." Monica looked up at the towering glass structure, shielding her eyes from the bright autumn sun. "You could have taken it all back today. Victor practically begged you to return to the executive floor. So why did you refuse to take your company back?" I stopped walking and looked at the massive building. Hundreds of people were working inside those walls, securing client data, building operational strategies, and earning a living for their own families. I started this entire operation from a borrowed desk in a freezing hospital basement 37 years ago. I spent my entire youth laying the foundation, but a true foundation is meant to be built upon, not hoarded as a personal trophy. Because it is not my company anymore, sweetheart, I replied, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my heart. A man builds an empire hoping it will make him immortal, but a father builds a legacy hoping it will outlive him completely. I fought Blake to protect our people and to save you, not to reclaim a desk I outgrew a decade ago. The mission belongs to all of them now. My daughter smiled, a genuine, quiet expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She linked her arm through mine, and we continued walking down the paved path together, leaving the corporate tower standing tall and secure behind us. You spend your entire youth building a solid foundation, pouring your soul into a legacy you desperately hope will outlive you. You lay the bricks, you weather the corporate storms, and you sacrifice the quiet, peaceful moments of your own life to ensure your family never has to experience the cold reality of genuine hardship. But eventually, a day arrives when you must step back. You hand over the keys. You trust the next generation to carry the weight of everything you created. And that is exactly when you discover the hardest, most profound truth about leaving a legacy. True strength is never about holding on to control until your hands bleed. True strength is having the courage to walk away, knowing that the foundation you built is sturdy enough to survive even the worst kinds of human greed. The deepest, most devastating wounds in our lives rarely come from strangers sitting across a polished boardroom table. They come from the very people we invite into our homes, the people we allow to sit at our dining tables and join our family traditions. When a person uses your own flesh and blood as a weapon against you, the betrayal cuts all the way down to the bone. You have to watch someone you love become a silent pawn in a dangerous game they do not even realize they are playing. It is a terrifying, suffocating kind of grief. You desperately want to shake them, to force them to see the ugly truth hidden behind a charming smile. But you cannot rush the shattering of a carefully crafted illusion. You simply have to wait. You have to stand perfectly steady in the middle of the storm, armed only with documented facts and quiet dignity, and wait for the fog to clear. Because genuine love does not mean blindly protecting someone from the painful consequences of their choices. Real love sometimes means letting them witness the destruction firsthand, so they can finally learn how to rebuild their own personal boundaries. We often confuse the concept of forgiveness with the act of forgetting. We mistakenly think moving forward requires us to completely erase the past, to pretend the lies and the deceit simply never happened. But genuine healing demands absolute, unwavering clarity. You can certainly forgive a child for losing their way in the dark, but you must also teach them how to read the map. You must show them that marriage certificates and blood ties do not grant anyone the right to bypass basic moral accountability. An apology delivered without a fundamental change in behavior is just another form of deception. When you finally stop trying to rescue the people who actively choose to burn the house down, you give the people who truly care about the foundation a fighting chance to thrive. You learn that a lasting legacy is not a towering glass building, a corner office, or a massive bank account. A true legacy is the quiet, unbreakable dignity you maintain when everything else tries to pull you into the mud. Have you ever had to stand back and watch someone you deeply love be completely deceived by a person they trusted implicitly? How did you find the incredible strength to hold on to the truth when everyone else was swept up in the carefully constructed lie? Please share your personal experiences in the comments below. Your journey, your survival, and your hard-earned wisdom might be exactly what another listener desperately needs to hear today to finally find their own courage.